My name is Loretta. I am 72 years old, and my occupation is a retired real estate investor. My own flesh and blood locked me away in a dismal facility, practically salivating at the thought of claiming the estate I spent a lifetime building from the ground up. He truly believed that disposing of his elderly mother meant he finally held the keys to the kingdom. What my greedy son did not realize was that his betrayal had just activated a trap I set years ago. He had absolutely no idea that my attorney was about to strip him of every single penny and leave him out on the street. The lobby of Shady Pines nursing home smelled exactly like surrender. It was a suffocating mix of industrial bleach and overcooked cabbage that made my stomach churn. I sat completely still in a cold vinyl wheelchair that I did not even need, clutching a flimsy plastic bag that held just a few changes of clothes. Across the sterile room, my son Jamal leaned over the reception desk. He was hurriedly signing the commitment papers, pressing the pen down so hard his knuckles turned white. He refused to look my way. He could not even bear to meet the eyes of the woman who had sacrificed everything to give him a perfect life. Beside him stood his wife, Chloe. She wore a designer coat paid for with my money, and a smirk that she did not even bother to hide. I watched her lean into Jamal, her pale hand resting on his shoulder, and I heard her whisper loud enough for the echo to carry across the quiet hall. "We finally have the keys to the kingdom." She thought I was just a broken-down, senile old woman who had finally been put out to pasture. She thought the sprawling suburban house they had been living in, rent-free for 3 years, was finally hers to sell. Jamal turned around his face, a mask of fake sorrow that he had perfected over the last few weeks. He walked over to me, cleared his throat, and said he was doing this because he loved me and wanted me to be safe. I looked into the eyes of the boy I had raised by myself. The boy whose college tuition I paid in cash by working 3 jobs and flipping properties until my hands bled. For 40 years I built a quiet empire, so my son would never know the struggles I faced. I kept my wealth discreet, wanting him to build his own character. Instead, he let his wife turn him against me, treating me like a ghost in my own home. I did not scream today. I did not cry. I just nodded and let the orderly wheel me down that dark hallway. Let them have their moment of victory. Let them pop their expensive champagne in my living room and celebrate their newfound wealth. Because while they were busy plotting my demise, every asset I own was locked completely tight in a blind family trust. They were celebrating a kingdom they did not own, and their greed was about to leave them entirely homeless. I remember the days when my hands were calloused and my back ached so deeply I could barely stand up straight. Raising a boy on your own is never easy, but raising a black boy in this country means you have to work 10 times as hard just to make sure he has a fair starting line. When Jamal was growing up, I worked 3 jobs just to keep food on our table and a solid roof over our heads. I cleaned houses during the early morning hours, worked a cash register at a local grocery store in the afternoons, and took on ironing and alterations late into the night. I hardly slept, but I was not just surviving. I was planning for a future he could not yet see. Every extra dollar I made went straight into a savings account that nobody else knew about. When the time was right, I took a leap of faith and started buying distressed properties in up-and-coming neighborhoods. I would fix them up with my own 2 hands, painting walls, laying tile, repairing whatever was broken, and then I would flip them for a profit. I built a quiet real estate empire property by property, year by year, deliberately hiding my wealth behind a modest lifestyle, so my son would stay humble and driven. I wanted him to know the absolute value of hard work, but I also wanted to shield him from the crushing weight of poverty I had known all my life. When Jamal got accepted into a prestigious university, he sat at our old kitchen table with a stack of student loan applications, looking completely defeated. I will never forget the pure relief on his face when I took those papers, tore them into pieces, and handed him a cashier's check for his entire first year. I paid for his entire college education in cash. He graduated without a single dime of debt, free to conquer the world, without the burdens that hold so many of our young people back. By the time I finally retired, I had purchased a massive 6-bedroom suburban home. It was my ultimate sanctuary. The physical proof that all my sleepless nights and aching bones had amounted to something beautiful and lasting. It was a place meant for large family gatherings, for warm Sunday dinners, for absolute peace in my golden years. So 3 years ago, when Jamal came to me with his head bowed, admitting that he had hit severe financial trouble and could no longer afford his rent, I did not hesitate for a second. I opened my doors and allowed Jamal, his wife Chloe, and my beautiful 10-year-old granddaughter Tiana to move into my home. I told them it was a temporary arrangement, just a stepping stone until they could get back on their feet. I thought I was providing a safe harbor for my own blood. I had absolutely no idea I was inviting a devastating storm directly into my living room. At first, Chloe played the part of the perfect, gracious daughter-in-law. She is a white woman who always knew exactly what to say to make herself sound sweet, appreciative, and entirely harmless. She would thank me constantly, bringing me cups of herbal tea and complimenting the layout of my home. But as the months dragged on, that sugary facade began to crack piece by piece, revealing the calculating woman underneath. It started with small, subtle changes that I initially brushed off. I would come downstairs to find my expensive vintage armchairs pushed into the garage, replaced by cheap, cold, modern furniture that she claimed was much better for her back. When I tried to gently remind her that this was still my house, and my belongings held sentimental value, Jamal would immediately rush to her defense. The respectful, compassionate boy I had raised transformed into a distant, entitled stranger right before my very eyes. He would sigh heavily, roll his eyes like an irritable teenager, and tell me that I needed to be more accommodating, that Chloe was simply trying to make the space comfortable for their growing family. I watched my own son become a mere echo of his wife, repeating her complaints word for word, and treating me like an inconvenient guest in the very home I owned and maintained. The only pure, untainted joy I had left in that house was my granddaughter, Tiana. She is a bright, beautiful biracial girl with a spirited personality that reminds me so much of myself at her age. Tiana and I had a truly special bond. Every Saturday morning, we would stand side by side at the kitchen counter, covered in flour, baking peach cobblers, and sweet potato pies from scratch. We would laugh until our stomachs hurt, sharing little secrets and building precious memories that I cherished more than any property I ever bought or sold. But Chloe could not stand to see us so incredibly close. She began finding constant excuses to interrupt our sacred time together. First, she would suddenly need Tiana to run mundane errands. Then she started hovering in the kitchen like a hawk, criticizing everything we did and complaining about the sugar content. Eventually, the isolation became highly deliberate and incredibly cruel. Chloe started pulling Tiana away from me, entirely weaponizing my age against me. She would look at me with a sickeningly fake smile and tell Tiana to go play upstairs, because her grandmother was far too fragile to handle the noise and the mess of baking. Too fragile. I had spent 40 long years laying heavy hardwood floors and negotiating cutthroat real estate deals. But to Chloe, I was just a brittle, declining old woman who needed to be kept completely out of the way. She was systematically erasing me from my own family, painting me as weak and helpless, and deliberately laying the groundwork for a betrayal I never saw coming. I had paid for every single brick of this massive house with my own blood and sweat. Yet I slowly became a ghost, wandering through my own hallways. Chloe and Jamal began treating my presence as if it were a mild inconvenience, a problem they simply had to tolerate. The disrespect did not happen overnight. It was a slow, calculated erasure. It began with my vintage furniture. One afternoon, while I was out grocery shopping my beautiful solid mahogany dining table, the very table where I had hosted decades of warm Thanksgiving dinners, completely vanished. In its place stood a cold, flimsy glass contraption that looked like it belonged in a sterile corporate office. When I confronted Chloe, asking where my cherished table had gone, she did not even have the decency to look apologetic. She just waved her manicured hand dismissively and stated that my things were hopelessly outdated and clashed terribly with her modern aesthetic. Jamal did not even look up from his phone to defend me. He simply mumbled that Chloe had a fantastic eye for interior design, and I should just let her update the space. I swallowed my hurt and bit my tongue, desperate to maintain peace in my home for the sake of my granddaughter Tiana. But the boundaries continued to crumble. The intrusion escalated drastically when Chloe's older brother Bradley started showing up uninvited. Bradley was a sleazy, fast-talking real estate appraiser with shifty eyes and a fake smile that made my skin crawl. He would wander through my private living spaces, carrying a clipboard, casually knocking on the walls, meticulously inspecting the crown molding, and pacing the perimeter of my property as if he were preparing a commercial listing. I felt entirely violated. One Tuesday afternoon, I walked into my private study and caught Bradley on his hands and knees, running a tape measure across the original oak floorboards. I firmly demanded to know what on earth he was doing in my private sanctuary. Jamal rushed into the room, stepping between Bradley and me with a loud, irritated sigh. He looked down at me as if I were a confused toddler throwing a tantrum. "Bradley is just checking for termites, Mom," Jamal said, his voice dripping with annoyance. "Do not be paranoid." Paranoid. The word stung like a physical slap across the face. I had flipped enough houses in my 40 years of business to know the undeniable difference between a simple pest inspection and a comprehensive property appraisal. Yet Jamal looked at me with such overwhelming condescension that I actually doubted myself for a fleeting second. I wanted so desperately to preserve the fragile illusion of our family unit that I forced myself to ignore the glaring red flags waving right in front of my face. I retreated to my bedroom quietly, allowing these intruders to measure the dimensions of my life, completely unaware of the trap they were building around me. The blatant disrespect soon mutated into something far more sinister and terrifying. Chloe began a systematic, malicious psychological campaign designed to make me look completely insane, utilizing tactics straight out of a manual for faking dementia. It started with my daily heart medication. I have always been a highly organized woman, keeping my pill container on the exact same corner of the kitchen counter every single day. One morning, the container was simply gone. I searched the kitchen frantically for hours, my chest tightening with genuine panic as my heart rate elevated. Chloe finally pulled the container out from the very back of the dark pantry, looking at me with a sickeningly sweet expression of fake pity. She gently touched my arm and told me I must have put it there by accident, while putting away the morning groceries. I knew for a fact I had not touched the pantry, but the absolute unwavering certainty in her voice made me pause and question my own memory. A few days later, the stakes grew dangerously high. I was upstairs in my bedroom quietly folding laundry when the piercing, deafening shriek of the smoke detector shattered the quiet afternoon. I rushed downstairs as fast as my legs could carry me, only to find the kitchen filled with thick, acrid smoke. One of the gas stove burners was turned on high, and a dry dish towel was smouldering dangerously close to the open flame. I grabbed the towel and threw it into the sink, turning off the gas just as Jamal stormed through the front door. He did not ask if I was all right. He cornered me against the counter, his face red with unbridled fury, screaming that I was going to burn the house down and kill them all. I tried desperately to explain that I had not even been in the kitchen, that I had not cooked a single thing all morning, but my protests were entirely drowned out by his rage. Chloe stood just behind him, shaking her head tragically, whispering loud enough for me to hear that episodes of severe confusion were completely normal at my advanced age. The gaslighting was relentless, isolating, and terrifyingly effective. I started second-guessing my own mind every minute of the day. I began to wonder if my sharp intellect was truly slipping away into the shadows of old age. The final crushing blow to my confidence came when my late husband's gold pocket watch vanished from my bedside nightstand. It was my most treasured possession in the entire world, the only thing I had left of the man I loved. I tore my bedroom apart, weeping in absolute despair, searching under the bed and inside every drawer. Jamal burst into my room, completely exasperated by my tears. He marched into my bathroom, reached into the bottom of the trash can, and pulled out the gold watch. He held it up like a victorious trophy, proving my supposed mental decline. He yelled that I was becoming a severe danger to myself and a massive, exhausting burden to his family. He told me I was losing my mind, and God help me. The sheer exhaustion and constant manipulation made me actually begin to believe him. For weeks, I lived in a state of constant suffocating fear in the house I owned. I walked on eggshells, terrified to touch the stove, terrified to speak, terrified that I was slowly descending into a dark abyss of insanity. I isolated myself in my bedroom, crying silently into my pillow so they would not hear my pain. I was completely broken, just as Chloe had meticulously planned. They had brutally stripped away my confidence and made me a prisoner of my own self-doubt, preparing me for the ultimate slaughter. I felt entirely alone, convinced that my brilliant mind was failing me, and that I truly needed the help they offered. I stopped baking with Tiana, afraid I might accidentally harm my precious granddaughter. Every ounce of my independence was systematically dismantled by the two people who lived under my roof and ate the food I provided. The horrifying truth finally revealed itself on a humid, oppressive night in late August. It was 2 a.m. and the heavy silence of the house was absolute. I woke up with a parched throat, my mouth completely dry from the relentless anxiety that now dictated my every waking moment. I slipped out of my bed and crept down the hallway, intending to just grab a quick glass of cold water from the kitchen. As I approached the top of the wooden staircase, I heard the faint, muffled sound of intense voices. I paused instantly, my heart doing a nervous, erratic flutter in my chest. The voices were floating up from the kitchen. I crept down the steps in my bare feet, making absolutely sure to avoid the loose floorboards I knew would creak. I stood perfectly still in the dark shadow of the dining room archway, holding my breath. Jamal, Chloe, and Bradley were huddled tightly around the kitchen island, illuminated only by the harsh blue glow of Bradley's open laptop screen. I could hear every single word with terrifying crystal clarity. Bradley tapped the laptop screen and announced with a greedy grin that he had officially appraised the estate at $2.5 million. My blood ran completely cold in my veins. $2.5 million. Chloe let out a frustrated, dramatic sigh, taking a long sip from a glass of red wine. She complained bitterly that I was entirely too healthy, whining that they simply could not afford to wait around for me to die naturally. Her voice was utterly devoid of human empathy or warmth. It was the chilling voice of a predator, calmly calculating the exact monetary value of its prey. Then my own son spoke, and his words destroyed the last remaining piece of my maternal heart. Jamal confessed, his voice laced with frantic panic, that he had actually lost his lucrative corporate job over 6 months ago. He admitted he was drowning in suffocating debt, with creditors threatening to seize his luxury cars and ruin his life. He had been lying to my face every single day, leaving the house every morning in a tailored suit, just to maintain a pathetic hollow facade. But it was their proposed solution to his financial ruin that truly horrified me to my core. Jamal laid out the plot with chilling sociopathic precision. They were going to use the fabricated stove incidents and my supposed memory loss to legally declare me mentally incompetent. He planned to forcibly commit me to a rundown state-funded nursing facility, a place where forgotten people go to wither away and die in the dark. Once I was safely locked away behind closed doors, they would execute a forged power of attorney that Bradley had already drawn up for them. With that fraudulent legal document in hand, they would legally liquidate my entire estate, sell my beautiful house right out from under me, and use the $2.5 million to wipe out Jamal's massive debt and fund their lavish, deceitful lifestyle. They laughed. My son actually chuckled a dark, cruel laugh, as Bradley assured him that no judge in the world would ever question a loving son making tough medical decisions for his poor, senile mother. I stood frozen in the pitch-black dining room, my hand pressed hard against my mouth to stifle the sharp gasp that threatened to tear from my throat. The pain of that absolute betrayal was a physical agony. A sharp, twisting knife plunged directly into my chest. The boy I had scrubbed dirty floors to feed the boy whose education I had paid for with my own sweat and tears was calmly discussing locking me in a cage to steal my life's work. I felt a hot tear slide down my cheek, but it was the very last tear I would ever shed for Jamal. In that shadowed hallway, the frightened, confused old woman they had worked so hard to create simply died. A cold, fierce clarity washed over me, sharpening my senses and steadying my trembling hands. I reached into the pocket of my robe, pulled out my smartphone, and hit the record button. I held the device perfectly still, capturing every sinister detail of their conspiracy. Every cruel laugh. Every piece of undeniable evidence of their impending fraud. I recorded them sealing their own fate. When I had enough, I silently retreated back up the stairs, my steps light and incredibly purposeful. I was no longer a victim waiting to be slaughtered in the dark. I was a mother who had been pushed entirely too far, and I was going to teach them exactly why you never corner a woman who built her kingdom from the dirt. Exactly 1 week after that horrifying night in the kitchen, the trap they had been building finally snapped shut. I was sitting in my living room peacefully drinking my morning tea when the front door swung open. Jamal marched in with a stack of flattened cardboard boxes, followed closely by Chloe and a man I had never seen before. He was a tall, severe-looking white man carrying a black leather briefcase. They did not even have the decency to greet me. Chloe immediately began tossing my personal belongings into the boxes, grabbing my framed family photographs, my favorite throw pillows, and my books, dumping them in without a single ounce of care. I stood up, my heart pounding a frantic rhythm against my ribs, and demanded to know what was happening. Jamal refused to look me in the eye. He stared at the wall just above my head and told me in a flat, rehearsed voice that they were moving me out. He introduced the stranger as Dr. Evans, a supposedly independent specialist. I knew instantly this was Bradley's crooked friend. Dr. Evans stepped forward and began firing questions at me with rapid, aggressive speed. He asked me what year it was, what I had eaten for breakfast 3 days ago, and where I kept my medications. He did not wait for my answers. He spoke over me, deliberately trying to confuse and agitate me. When I firmly told him to leave my house, Chloe stepped right up to my face and smirked. She told the doctor that my aggression was a new symptom, that I had been leaving the gas stove on and putting my granddaughter in mortal danger. Dr. Evans nodded sympathetically at Chloe, pulled a pre-written medical evaluation from his briefcase, and signed his name at the bottom. With one stroke of a pen, this corrupt man declared me unfit to care for myself. Jamal finally looked at me, and the coldness in his eyes chilled my soul. He stepped close, his voice dropping into a vicious, quiet threat. He told me I had two choices. I could go quietly to a facility called Sunny Pines, or they would drag me through a brutal court battle. He leaned in and whispered that if I fought them, he would make sure I never saw Tiana again. He would tell the judge I was a physical danger to her, and he would legally banish me from my granddaughter's life forever. The threat hit me like a physical blow to the stomach. Tiana was my heart, the only pure thing left in this family. The thought of losing her, of letting Chloe poison her mind against me permanently, was a pain I could not bear. But I also knew I had a secret weapon. I realized that arguing with them right now would only play into their narrative of an agitated, unstable woman. To protect my granddaughter, and buy the precious time I needed, I had to give them exactly what they wanted. I let my shoulders slump. I forced my hands to tremble, and I allowed a few tears of genuine heartbreak to fall down my cheeks. I played the part of the defeated, broken old woman to absolute perfection. I nodded my head, whispered that I would pack my clothes, and surrendered to their cruel demands. The ride to Sunny Pines was completely silent. The facility was exactly as Jamal had intended it to be, a bleak, forgotten place, meant to warehouse the elderly until they passed away. The lobby smelled overwhelmingly of stale bleach and boiled cabbage. The walls were painted a depressing, washed-out yellow, and the fluorescent lights hummed with a headache-inducing buzz. Jamal signed the admission papers at the front desk, with a sickening eagerness, practically shoving the clipboard back at the receptionist. Chloe stood beside him, clutching her designer purse, her eyes roaming the miserable surroundings with obvious satisfaction. They left me sitting in a vinyl wheelchair in the hallway, dropping a single plastic bag of my clothes at my feet. They walked out the double-glass doors without looking back, leaving me alone in the sterile silence. As soon as a tired-looking nurse wheeled me into a cramped, shared room and left me alone, my entire demeanor changed. The trembling in my hands stopped instantly. I stood up from the wheelchair, my spine straightening, shaking off the frail persona I had worn for the past 3 hours. I walked over to the narrow hospital bed, sat on the edge, and slipped off my right shoe. Hidden deep inside the toe of my loafer was a small prepaid burner phone. I powered the device on my thumb, moving with steady precision as I dialed a number I knew by heart. The phone rang twice before a deep, authoritative voice answered. It was Mr. Reginald Hayes, my longtime trust attorney. Reginald was a brilliant, sharply dressed African-American man who commanded respect in every courtroom he entered. He had managed my blind trust for over 15 years, and he was as ruthless as he was loyal. I did not waste time with pleasantries. I told him exactly where I was, and exactly what Jamal and Chloe had done. I then transferred the audio file I had recorded in my dark dining room a week earlier, the recording of Jamal, Chloe, and Bradley planning to steal my estate. I sat on the edge of that stiff mattress, listening to Reginald breathe heavily as he played the audio on his end. When the recording finished, the silence on the line was thick with righteous fury. Reginald told me, his voice dangerously low, that Jamal had just made the biggest mistake of his miserable life. I asked Reginald about the forged power of attorney Bradley had prepared for them. I needed to know if they could actually sell my home while I was trapped in this facility. Reginald let out a dry, humorless laugh that echoed through the phone. He explained the beautiful, airtight legal reality of my situation. He reminded me that over a decade ago, we had placed every single property, every bank account, and every investment into an irrevocable trust. I did not technically own the 6-bedroom house they were living in. The trust owned it, because the trust was irrevocable and managed by specific legal stipulations. A simple power of attorney was completely worthless. Jamal could forge my signature 1,000 times over, and it would not grant him the legal authority to sell a single blade of grass on that property. Reginald assured me that the document Bradley created was nothing more than a useless piece of trash. They could not touch my assets. They could not touch my bank accounts. And their entire grand scheme was built on a legal impossibility. A wave of profound relief washed over me, closely followed by a cold, calculating determination. I asked Reginald what our next move should be. I wanted to march out of this facility and have them arrested for elder abuse right then and there. But Reginald, always the masterful strategist, stopped me. He explained that if we brought the police in now, Jamal and Chloe would only get a slap on the wrist. They would claim it was a misunderstanding, that they genuinely thought I was sick, and Bradley would claim the power of attorney was just a draft. They would walk away with minor consequences. Reginald proposed a much more devastating plan. He told me we needed to let them proceed. We needed to let them step right into the snare they had set for me. We would give them enough rope to hang themselves completely. If we let Jamal and Chloe attempt to execute the sale of the house using the forged documents, the charges would escalate dramatically. Once Jamal signed a real estate contract representing himself as the legal owner, and once Bradley used his professional appraisal license to fast-track a fraudulent sale, they would be crossing a massive legal line. Reginald explained that because the buyers would likely use electronic bank transfers across state lines to secure the mortgage, Jamal and Bradley would be committing federal wire fraud. That was not a simple family dispute. That was a federal felony carrying mandatory prison time. I agreed to the plan without a shred of hesitation. For the next 3 weeks, I remained quietly in my room at Sunny Pines. I ate the terrible food, I smiled at the nurses, and I played the role of the docile grandmother perfectly. But every single night when the lights went out, I was on my burner phone with Reginald tracking my family's rapid descent into absolute ruin. Reginald had his private investigators monitoring their every move. The updates he gave me were staggering in their sheer audacity. Just 3 days after locking me away, Jamal officially listed my $2.5 million house on the market. Because the property was in pristine condition in a highly sought-after neighborhood, they received a cash offer almost immediately. Bradley acted as the appraiser and inspector, completely bypassing standard legal protocols and putting his own state license on the line to push the paperwork through the system. But it was their spending that truly showcased the depth of their greed. Believing that a massive windfall of cash was only days away, Jamal and Chloe completely lost their minds. Reginald reported that Jamal had maxed out every single credit card he had left to lease 2 brand-new luxury sports cars. Chloe had been seen parading around town, buying designer handbags, expensive jewelry, and booking first-class tickets for a European vacation they planned to take the moment the house closed. They were throwing extravagant dinner parties in my dining room, bragging to their friends about their incredible real estate success. They were living like royalty on borrowed money, entirely convinced that they had outsmarted a foolish old woman. Sitting in my cramped hospital bed, staring at the peeling yellow paint on the wall, I felt a deep, steady satisfaction replacing my heartbreak. They thought they had buried me alive in this place. They had no idea that I was the one holding the shovel. They were frantically digging a hole so deep that they would never be able to climb out. Every forged signature, every leased vehicle, and every boastful lie was cementing their path to a federal indictment. I patiently bided my time, waiting for the exact moment when their greed would reach its absolute peak, knowing that the closing day would be the final, spectacular end to their kingdom of lies. The bright morning sun poured through the massive bay windows of my living room, casting a warm, golden glow over the expensive crystal glasses clinking together. Today was the day of the closing. Standing in the very center of my foyer were Jamal, Chloe, and Bradley, looking like they had just conquered the world. They were hosting a lavish celebratory toast with the prospective buyers, and a highly respectable local notary. Chloe was wearing a brand new silk dress that she had undoubtedly bought on my credit, holding a flute of expensive champagne and laughing loudly. Jamal stood beside her, beaming with the arrogant pride of a man who thought he had just secured a $2.5 million windfall. They were so utterly consumed by their own greed that they never even heard the heavy mahogany front doors swing wide open. I stepped over the threshold, and the sudden draft of crisp air made everyone turn around. I was no longer the defeated, fragile old woman they had dumped in a wheelchair at that miserable nursing home. I was dressed immaculately in a tailored, sharp burgundy suit that I had bought specifically for this occasion. My hair perfectly styled, my posture straight and commanding. Flanking me on my right was Mr. Reginald Hayes, carrying his thick leather briefcase, and on my left stood two uniformed police officers, with their hands resting firmly on their utility belts. The music playing softly in the background suddenly felt deafening as the entire room fell into an absolute suffocating silence. The joyful clinking of glasses stopped immediately. Jamal froze completely, his eyes widening in pure horror as his champagne flute slipped from his fingers and shattered into a dozen pieces on the hardwood floor. Chloe turned the color of ash, her smug grin melting away into a look of sheer terror. Bradley took a nervous step backward, his eyes darting toward the back door as if calculating how fast he could run. Jamal, desperate to maintain his carefully constructed illusion in front of the wealthy buyers, stumbled forward. He tried to put on a mask of deep, frantic concern. He raised his hands in a placating gesture and forced his voice to tremble. He asked me what on earth I was doing here, and demanded to know who had let me out of the medical facility. He turned to the police officers and the buyers, loudly claiming that my mind was completely gone, that I was suffering from severe delusions, and that I was a physical danger to myself. It was a pathetic, desperate attempt to hold on to his fabricated narrative. I did not back down. I raised my hand and silenced him with a single authoritative glare that a mother reserves only for a deeply disobedient child. I looked directly at the bewildered buyers and told them they were about to make the most devastating financial mistake of their entire lives. Reaching into my tailored pocket, I pulled out my phone, turned the volume all the way up, and pressed play. My phone broadcasted the crystal-clear audio of the secret conversation I had recorded in my dark kitchen weeks ago. Jamal's panicked voice echoed through the grand foyer, admitting he had lost his job and was drowning in suffocating debt. Then came Chloe's cruel, heartless whining, complaining loudly that I was simply too healthy and they could not afford to wait around for me to die. Finally, Bradley's voice rang out, confirming he had drawn up a fake power of attorney to bypass the courts and steal my estate. The recording captured their dark laughter, their sinister plotting, and their complete lack of human decency. The buyers gasped in absolute shock, immediately stepping away from Jamal as if he were carrying a deadly disease. The notary quickly grabbed her official stamp, shoved it into her bag, and backed against the wall. Chloe covered her mouth with her trembling hands, tears of panic springing to her eyes as the undeniable truth of her wicked conspiracy was laid bare for everyone in the room to witness. Before Jamal could even attempt to utter another pathetic lie, Mr. Reginald Hayes stepped forward and dropped the legal hammer with crushing precision. His deep voice boomed with absolute authority. He announced to the room that he represented the sole legal entity that owned this property, an irrevocable blind family trust. He explained that Loretta did not technically own the house in a way that could ever be signed over by a standard medical proxy. Therefore, the power of attorney that Bradley had drafted and Jamal had aggressively used to secure this sale was not just completely void, it was entirely fraudulent. Reginald then turned his piercing gaze directly onto Bradley. He stated that by utilizing his professional real estate appraiser license to deliberately fast-track a fraudulent sale, And by attempting to process electronic bank transfers across state lines with these innocent buyers, Bradley had brazenly committed federal wire fraud. At those words, the two police officers moved forward without hesitation. They grabbed Bradley by the arms, spun him around, and clamped heavy steel handcuffs tightly around his wrists. Bradley began to shout and beg, claiming he was only trying to help his sister. But the officers loudly read him his Miranda rights and marched him straight out the front door to a waiting squad car. Reginald then reached into his leather briefcase and pulled out a crisp white envelope, handing it directly to Jamal. It was an immediate 24-hour eviction notice authorized by the trust. Reginald informed them that they had exactly until tomorrow morning to pack their personal belongings and vacate the premises, or they would be arrested for criminal trespassing. Jamal physically collapsed. His knees hit the hardwood floor and he began to sob uncontrollably. He reached out to grab the hem of my suit jacket, begging and pleading for mercy. He cried out that we were family, that he had made a terrible mistake out of financial desperation, and that I could not possibly throw my own blood out onto the street. He desperately tried to use Tiana as leverage, crying that I was going to make my innocent granddaughter homeless. I looked down at the man I had sacrificed my entire life to raise. My heart, which had broken into a million pieces the night they locked me in that miserable nursing home, was now hardened into absolute diamond. I stared directly into his panicked, tear-filled eyes and delivered the fatal blow. I told him that I had spent 40 years scrubbing floors and flipping houses to build this entire empire exclusively for him. I told him that he sold his soul, betrayed his mother, and committed federal crimes for an estate he was already going to inherit free and clear. But now, because of his boundless greed and staggering cruelty, he would get absolutely nothing. Chloe broke down in wild theatrical hysterics. She screamed at the top of her lungs, ripping at her own hair as the crushing reality washed over her. The luxury cars she had leased, the designer bags she had flaunted, and the wealthy lifestyle she thought she had stolen were vanishing right before her eyes. The police officers returned to the foyer and sternly ordered Jamal and Chloe to gather only their immediate necessities under strict supervision. I stood tall in the center of my beautiful home, feeling the heavy, suffocating weight of their betrayal finally lift off my shoulders, peacefully reclaiming the kingdom I had rightfully earned. 6 months have passed since that morning. I am back in the quiet sanctuary of my beautiful home. The courts moved swiftly, granting me full custody of my precious Tiana. Jamal and Chloe are currently sitting in federal holding, awaiting their lengthy prison sentences for wire fraud and massive debt evasion. I sit on my back porch now, sipping a warm cup of herbal tea, watching Tiana chase butterflies in the blooming garden. The sharp pain of my son's ultimate betrayal still lingers. In the quiet moments, a dull ache that reminds me of my own flesh and blood. But I have found my absolute peace. I learned the hardest way possible that true family is built on respect and loyalty, not just a shared last name. A mother will sacrifice everything to protect her child, but unconditional love should never mean becoming a silent victim to their boundless greed. If you really liked my story, please like this video, subscribe to the channel, and tell me in the comments, where exactly are you watching from today, and what time is it there right now? Always remember to protect your peace, ladies. I will see you in the next story.